Examine this photograph carefully. The sepia-toned image before you, discovered in 1921 within the sealed archives of St. Agatha's Convent in northern Michigan, depicts a woman in her early 30s, her face partially obscured by the traditional habit of the Sisters of Divine Mercy. Notice her eyes, how they avoid the camera's gaze, and the peculiar tension in her hands, clasped not in prayer but in what appears to be restraint. This is Sister Magdalena Krawiec, born Elżbieta Krawiec in 1843 to Polish immigrants in Buffalo, New York. By 1876, she would become the central figure in one of the most disturbing and meticulously concealed incidents in American ecclesiastical history, a case that challenges our understanding of faith, biology, and the dark corridors of institutional power. The photograph was taken in December 1875, mere weeks before the events that would lead to murder and a conspiracy of silence spanning generations. What you are about to witness is the systematic revelation of a narrative long buried by both church and state authorities, the extraordinary case of an infertile nun who, upon discovering her impossible pregnancy, took the life of the priest involved in a manner so ritualistic that initial investigators refused to document their findings in official records. The Polish immigrant community of Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the 1870s existed in relative isolation, their lives shaped by harsh winters, the demanding labor of copper mining and logging, and the steadfast rhythms of Catholic devotion. St. Agatha's Convent, established in 1862 through donations from these working-class families, stood as a symbol of spiritual persistence in an unforgiving landscape. The convent's weathered limestone exterior, quarried from local stone and hauled by parishioners' oxen teams, housed a community of sisters primarily engaged in education and medical care for the surrounding settlements. Archival photographs reveal a severe two-story structure with narrow windows and a modest bell tower, surrounded by dense pine forests that seem to encroach upon the building like silent sentinels. Former residents of the area, interviewed in the 1950s, recalled St. Agatha's as a place of both comfort and mystery, with one elderly woman noting that, even as children, we sensed there were spaces within those walls where we were not welcome, conversations that fell silent when we entered a room. The story begins not with Sister Magdalena, but with the arrival of Father Alexander Wojciechowski at St. Agatha's in the autumn of 1874. The Polish-born priest, aged 42, had been transferred from a parish in Cleveland following what diocesan correspondents cryptically referred to as matters of health and temperament requiring rural appointment. Documents recovered from the Archdiocese of Detroit in 1967 reveal that Father Wojciechowski had been the subject of 3 separate complaints from female parishioners, though the precise nature of these complaints was expunged from official records. What remains clear from surviving letters is that Bishop Caspar Borges considered the priest troubled but salvageable, and believed the isolation of St. Agatha's, a remote convent and adjoining church serving Polish immigrants in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, would provide necessary distance from temptations. The bishop's judgment would prove catastrophically flawed. Father Wojciechowski's seminary records, preserved in fragmentary form at St. Mary's Provincial Seminary, present a study in contradictions. His academic transcripts indicate exceptional theological acumen, particularly in biblical exegesis and languages, with one professor noting his remarkable capacity to illumine obscure scriptural passages with unexpected clarity. Yet his behavioral evaluations contain veiled references to periodic episodes of spiritual aridity requiring special counsel, and an intensity in devotional practices that occasionally manifests as concerning fixation. Most telling is an observation from his spiritual director in 1859, who wrote, "Candidate Wojciechowski exhibits a troubling dualism in his understanding of human nature, alternating between periods of ascetic self-denial and concerning preoccupation with theological interpretations of physical desire." This dualism requires careful monitoring as he progresses toward ordination. Despite these warnings, Wojciechowski was ordained in 1861, with his superior noting that his intellectual gifts outweighed concerns about his, quote, occasionally unorthodox interpretations of doctrine. Father Wojciechowski arrived at St. Agatha's on September 17, 1874, greeted by Mother Superior Constance Nowak and a congregation of 17 nuns, among them Sister Magdalena, who served as the convent's infirmarian. Contemporary accounts describe Wojciechowski as charismatic but mercurial, with one parishioner noting in her diary that the priest possessed eyes that could shift from celestial rapture to something altogether worldly in the turning of a phrase. His sermons quickly became renowned throughout the region, drawing worshippers from as far as 40 miles away, particularly for his Lenten homilies on redemption and divine forgiveness. Anna Kowalczyk, who attended St. Agatha's as a child, recalled in a 1943 oral history, "Father Alexander spoke with such passion that sometimes the women would weep openly. He had this way of making sin sound almost beautiful in its description, before bringing down God's judgment like thunder. There was something in his voice during those moments, something that made you feel both frightened and strangely drawn to whatever terrible thing he was describing." The priest's personal quarters, attached to the church by a covered walkway, became a repository for theological texts not typically found in rural parishes. Inventory records conducted after his death list volumes on medieval mysticism, obscure saints, lives focusing on miraculous physical transformations, and several texts on the spiritual interpretation of bodily afflictions. Most notable was his collection of commentaries on biblical women who experienced miraculous reversals of infertility, Sarah, Hannah, and Elizabeth, with extensive marginal notes in his distinctive handwriting. These annotations reveal a preoccupation with the concept of divine intervention in human reproduction, with one passage underlined repeatedly. "The opening of the barren womb stands as the ultimate demonstration of God's power to transform human impossibility into divine possibility." This theological fixation would take on disturbing significance in light of subsequent events. What makes this case particularly extraordinary are the medical records of Sister Magdalena, preserved by Dr. Frederick Hammond, the region's only physician. Hammond's meticulous documentation, discovered in 1953 within the walls of his former residence during renovation, indicates that Sister Magdalena had consulted him in 1871 regarding monthly distress of unusual severity. His examination led to a diagnosis of what was then termed congenital malformation of the reproductive organs, with Hammond concluding that conception would be an impossibility given the structural deficiencies observed. In his private notes, Hammond elaborated that Sister Magdalena possessed, quote, "a uterine anomaly rendering the patient sterile beyond question," a condition he attributed to an incomplete development of reproductive structures. The doctor's comprehensive case history of Sister Magdalena provides rare insight into her life before taking religious vows. Born Elżbieta Krawiec in 1843, she was the third of 7 children, only 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Hammond's notes record her describing childhood symptoms consistent with modern understanding of endometriosis and related conditions. Severe menstrual pain beginning at her first cycle, irregular patterns of bleeding, and chronic abdominal discomfort. At 19, she consulted a physician in Buffalo who informed her that her internal configuration made marriage inadvisable, as she would never bear children and intimate relations would likely cause significant pain. Hammond's notes record her explaining that this diagnosis clarified her calling to religious life, as she had already felt drawn to service but had been considering marriage to please her family. "If God has designed my body for sterility," she told Hammond, "then perhaps he intends my life to be fruitful in other ways." Her entrance into the Sisters of Divine Mercy in 1863 coincided with the Civil War's height, and convent records indicate that Sister Magdalena served briefly as a nurse in a military hospital in Pennsylvania before being assigned to St. Agatha's in 1865. Fellow sisters described her as methodical and withdrawn, but possessed of unexpected gentleness when treating the ill. Her appointment as infirmarian in 1869 leveraged both her natural inclinations and the practical medical knowledge she had acquired during her hospital service. Dr. Hammond's initial examination in 1871 was sought not for reproductive concerns, which she had long accepted, but for relief from persistent pain that interfered with her duties. Hammond prescribed various treatments common to the era: belladonna tinctures, herbal compresses, and dietary modifications, noting that Sister Magdalena approached her suffering with remarkable stoicism, concerned primarily with maintaining her ability to care for others despite her condition. This medical reality forms the first inexplicable element of our narrative: how a woman medically certified as incapable of conception would, less than 5 years later, discover herself to be with child. The doctor's records from January 1876 contain a single, hastily written entry regarding Sister Magdalena. Patient returned in extreme distress. Claims impossible condition. Examination confirms pregnancy of approximately 3 months despite previous diagnosis. Medical anomaly defies explanation. Patient refused to identify responsible party but exhibited signs of severe psychological disturbance. Hammond later confided to his wife, as recorded in her diary entry of January 19, 1876. Frederick returned from the convent in a state I have never witnessed in our 18 years of marriage. His hands trembled so severely he could not hold his teacup. When I inquired about his distress, he would only say that he had encountered something that defied his medical understanding and threatened to undermine everything he believed about physical possibility. He has locked himself in his study with his medical texts and asked not to be disturbed. The winter of 1875–76 was documented as particularly harsh in the Upper Peninsula, with temperatures plunging to unprecedented lows and snowfall isolating communities for weeks at a time. Meteorological records from Marquette, the nearest weather station, show that January 1876 brought over 9 feet of accumulated snow, with temperatures rarely rising above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. This environmental isolation created a hermetically sealed world at St. Agatha's, where external oversight became physically impossible and internal dynamics intensified without the relieving influence of outside contact. Local newspapers reported multiple deaths from exposure that winter, with one editorial noting that, quote, "Even the most mundane journey becomes a life-threatening endeavor in these conditions, and many communities have effectively ceased communication with the wider world until the spring thaw permits safe passage." It was during this period of enforced seclusion that witnesses report Father Wojciechowski began conducting private spiritual counseling sessions with several nuns, including Sister Magdalena. Mother Superior Nowak's journal, recovered during the diocesan investigation of 1912, contains increasingly concerned entries regarding these sessions. Father insists these private consultations are necessary for spiritual advancement, yet I observe disturbing changes in the sisters involved. Magdalena, in particular, exhibits signs of nervous agitation following her weekly confessions. When questioned, she speaks of special penances and the need for absolute secrecy in matters of spiritual direction. "I have written to the bishop expressing my reservations, but the winter isolation prevents immediate communication." By early February 1876, Mother Nowak recorded that Sister Magdalena had become withdrawn, often missing morning prayers and appearing physically unwell. The Mother Superior attributed this to winter melancholy until February 12th, when she discovered Sister Magdalena unconscious in the convent's kitchen, having apparently collapsed while preparing the morning meal. Sister Veronica Jablonski, who assisted in carrying Sister Magdalena to the infirmary, later provided testimony that adds crucial detail to our understanding of that morning. "As we lifted Sister Magdalena's unconscious form, I noticed a peculiar firmness to her abdomen that seemed inconsistent with her otherwise slight frame. When my hand inadvertently pressed against this area, she regained consciousness momentarily and clutched at me, whispering, 'It moves within me like judgment.' The wild terror in her eyes in that moment haunts me still." She then lapsed back into unconsciousness, but her hands remained protectively crossed over her midsection in a gesture I did not understand at the time. Sister Veronica's testimony, recorded during the ecclesiastical investigation of 1912 when she was an elderly nun in Chicago, represents one of the few first-hand accounts from someone who observed Sister Magdalena during this critical period. Her recollection continues. "In the days that followed, Sister Magdalena alternated between periods of unnatural calm, during which she would sit for hours gazing at religious paintings in the common room, and episodes of intense distress, during which she would be found weeping before the altar in the chapel, her prayers incomprehensible mixtures of Polish and Latin. Dr. Hammond was summoned through treacherous conditions, arriving at St. Agatha's the following day. His examination of Sister Magdalena, conducted in the presence of Mother Nowak, confirmed what the Mother Superior had already begun to suspect. Sister Magdalena was with child, a revelation made all the more confounding by the doctor's previous diagnosis of infertility. Hammond's journal records Mother Nowak's reaction. The Reverend Mother turned ashen, crossing herself repeatedly, while murmuring prayers in Polish. When I reminded her of the impossibility of this condition given my previous examination, she regarded me with an expression I can only describe as terror, stating, "Then it is as she claimed, a visitation." When pressed for clarification, Mother Nowak would say nothing further, insisting that ecclesiastical authorities must be consulted before any discussion of the matter could proceed. What Mother Nowak did not reveal to Dr. Hammond was the private confession Sister Magdalena had made to her 2 days earlier, documented in a sealed letter discovered in 1912 within the Mother Superior's personal Bible. The letter, written in Sister Magdalena's distinctive hand, details allegations of systematic abuse by Father Wojciechowski during what she termed false sacraments, conducted in the sacristy after evening prayers, when the convent was silent and most sisters had retired. The letter describes rituals that began as seemingly legitimate spiritual exercises, but gradually incorporated elements that Sister Magdalena, despite her relative naivete in worldly matters, eventually recognized as inappropriate. She wrote of anointings with oils in places no proper sacrament would address, and prayers spoken against my skin rather than to heaven. Most disturbing was her description of a ritual Father Wojciechowski called, quote, the Restoration of Eve, which he claimed was an ancient rite for women suffering the curse of barrenness. The most disturbing aspect of Sister Magdalena's account was her claim that Father Wojciechowski had convinced her that her infertility was a form of divine punishment for unspecified sins in her past. According to her letter, he had instituted a program of special intercessions designed to restore her womanhood in the eyes of God, rituals that combined elements of legitimate Catholic sacraments with what appeared to be invented ceremonies involving physical contact, justified as the laying on of hands. Sister Magdalena wrote that she had initially accepted these rituals as genuine spiritual healing until the discovery of her pregnancy forced a horrific realization. What I believed to be divine healing was mortal sin, and what he claimed was spiritual rebirth was earthly violation. How can I, who was told by medical authority that my body could never bear life, now find myself in this impossible state? Either God has performed a miracle through the hands of a monster, or something more terrible than I can comprehend has occurred. I am trapped between miracle and abomination, with no path of escape that does not lead to ruin. The letter concludes with a passage that, in retrospect, contains clear indications of Sister Magdalena's deteriorating mental state and emerging homicidal ideation. I dream nightly of the angel who visited Abraham, staying his hand from sacrificing Isaac. But in my dreams the angel instead guides the blade, whispering that some sacrifices are commanded rather than forbidden. I wake with my hands still feeling the weight of the knife, and I wonder if I am being called to a terrible obedience. Mother, pray for my soul, for I fear it stands at a precipice from which there may be no earthly return. Mother Nowak later admitted to ecclesiastical investigators that she had interpreted this passage as expressing suicidal rather than homicidal thoughts, and had consequently focused on preventing Sister Magdalena from harming herself, never imagining she might direct violence toward Father Wojciechowski. The psychological impact of this realization on a woman who had devoted her life to religious service, who had been medically certified as incapable of conception, and who now found herself pregnant within the confines of a religious order where such a condition represented not just sin but a profound impossibility, cannot be overstated. Contemporary understanding of trauma was primitive at best, but modern psychological analysis of Sister Magdalena's writings in the weeks following her discovery suggests a severe dissociative state. Her journal entries transition from lucid, theological questioning to fragmented, apocalyptic imagery. By late February, she had begun describing visions of divine retribution and necessary sacrifice, interspersed with passages of self-loathing and references to biblical women who suffered reproductive afflictions. Most significant is her repeated reference to the Book of Judith, specifically the story of Judith beheading Holofernes, a text she had apparently been studying intensively in the convent's small library. Particularly revealing is a journal entry dated February 22, 1876, in which Sister Magdalena writes, "Today I contemplated Judith's righteousness in delivering her people through violence sanctified by necessity. The artist Artemisia's painting of this holy act hangs in my mind like a vision. The determination in Judith's eyes, the terrible necessity of her hands upon the sword. The blood flows black in the candlelight of my imagination. What is the difference between murder and sacrifice? Only the direction of the offering. One horizontal between mortals, one vertical toward heaven. If one's actions can be both simultaneously, does the vertical sanctify the horizontal?" This passage suggests not only her increasing fixation on violence as solution, but also a sophisticated theological rationalization that transformed murder from sin into sacrament in her disturbed mind. Sister Magdalena's behavior during this period, as documented by multiple witnesses, became increasingly erratic. Sister Agnes Josarnecki reported finding her in the chapel at midnight, prostrate before the altar in the form of a cross, murmuring what sounded like the Magnificat, but with altered words I could not fully distinguish. Kitchen staff noted that she had begun collecting and storing sharp implements, ostensibly for medical purposes but in quantities that seemed excessive. Most concerning was an incident reported by Sister Josephine Wozniak, who encountered Sister Magdalena in the convent's small library, surrounded by open religious texts and anatomical diagrams from medical books, meticulously copying passages about the neck's arterial structure alongside scriptural verses about divine justice. When questioned about this unusual study, Sister Magdalena reportedly replied, "I am preparing for a difficult surgery that will separate evil from innocence." On March 3, 1876, with snow still isolating St. Agatha's from neighboring communities, Sister Magdalena failed to appear for morning prayers. Her absence initially caused little concern, as her health had been visibly declining. However, when Father Wojciechowski also failed to arrive for morning Mass, Mother Superior Nowak dispatched 2 sisters to check both the priest's adjacent cottage and the infirmary, where Sister Magdalena had taken to spending much of her time. Sister Catherine Dombrowski was the first to enter the infirmary, discovering it empty but noting that the door connecting the room to the small chapel used by sisters too ill to attend main services was ajar. Her testimony, recorded during the ecclesiastical investigation of 1912, describes what she found. "I called Sister Magdalena's name as I approached the chapel door, receiving no response. Upon entering, I observed unusual shadows cast across the altar and detected a scent I initially could not identify but later recognized as blood." Father Wojciechowski was lying before the altar, positioned as if in prostration, but the quantity of blood surrounding him immediately indicated something terrible had occurred. I approached cautiously, observing that his head was nearly severed, attached by only a small portion of tissue at the back of the neck. Clutched in his right hand was his rosary, and arranged around his body were candles forming a perfect circle. Most disturbing was the altar cloth, which had been removed from the sacred table and placed over his lower body, saturated with blood, in a pattern suggesting deliberate application rather than natural flow. Sister Catherine's testimony continues with details that ecclesiastical authorities initially attempted to redact, but which were preserved in the original transcripts. Most disturbing was the arrangement of objects surrounding the body. A circle of precisely 13 candles enclosed the scene, each positioned at exact intervals. The priest's prayer book lay open at his feet, turned to the Psalm of Divine Justice, with certain verses underlined in what appeared to be blood. His stole had been removed and wound around his neck, partly embedded in the wound itself. On the altar stood a single chalice containing a mixture I later learned consisted of communion wine combined with blood. Written on the wall behind the altar, in Latin, but using blood as the medium, were the words, Sanguis, eius super nos, his blood be upon us. The methodical arrangement of these elements suggested not a frenzied attack, but a ritualized execution carried out with terrible precision and theological purpose. The discovery of Father Wojciechowski's body triggered an immediate but carefully managed response. Mother Nowak's first action, rather than alerting civil authorities, was to send for Bishop Borges via a trusted male employee of the convent, who was dispatched despite the treacherous conditions. Her second action was to order a complete lockdown of the convent, with no sister permitted to leave or communicate with outsiders under penalty of severe ecclesiastical discipline. Sister Magdalena was located in her cell, where she had returned after the killing, covered in blood, but in a state of unnatural calm. According to Sister Veronica's testimony, she sat on her bed still wearing her bloodied habit, her hands folded in her lap, speaking softly but clearly in Polish. She was reciting what I recognized as the prayer for the dying, typically spoken during last rites. When Mother Nowak entered the room, Sister Magdalena looked up with perfect lucidity and said, "I have performed the necessary surgery, Mother. The evil has been excised, but the innocent remains." She then placed her hand upon her abdomen in a protective gesture. Mother Nowak made the fateful decision to contain the situation without civil authority involvement, a decision later defended as necessary to prevent scandal that would damage countless innocent souls, but which effectively initiated the conspiracy of silence that would obscure the truth for generations. She ordered Sister Magdalena confined to her cell under constant supervision by two sisters, had Father Wojciechowski's body moved to the priest's residence and cleaned of its ritualistic elements, and convened an emergency meeting of the senior nuns to establish the official narrative. Father Wojciechowski had suffered a fatal accident while traversing between his cottage and the convent during a particularly fierce nighttime snowstorm. This narrative was reinforced through explicit instructions that positioned silence as a sacred duty necessary to protect the Church rather than as complicity in covering up a crime. The official death certificate for Father Wojciechowski, issued by local authorities on March 10, 1876, lists cause of death as misadventure during inclement weather, making no mention of the actual circumstances. This extraordinary discrepancy was the first indication of a coordinated effort to conceal the true nature of events at St. Agatha's. Bishop Borges arrived at the convent on March 15, having been informed by courier of an unspecified, quote, grave situation requiring immediate episcopal intervention. His private correspondence with Archbishop Williams of Boston, uncovered during the church reforms of the 1960s, reveals the calculated decision to manage the situation without civil authority involvement. The matter at St. Agatha's represents a catastrophic failure of oversight and moral governance that, were it to become public knowledge, would inflict incalculable damage upon the Church in these precarious times of anti-Catholic sentiment. The priest's remains have been interred with appropriate rites under the explanation of accidental death. The sister responsible has been remanded to the Magdalene Asylum in Detroit, under close supervision. Her condition presents additional complications that must be managed with absolute discretion. I have instructed Mother Nowak that all sisters present are bound under holy obedience never to speak of what transpired. The official record will state that Father Wojciechowski succumbed to exposure after becoming disoriented in a snowstorm while responding to an urgent call for last rites. The bishop's subsequent actions demonstrate the extent of ecclesiastical authority in 19th-century American communities, particularly those isolated by geography and ethnic identity. The local coroner, a Catholic named Thomas Murphy, accepted the accidental death determination without conducting a thorough examination of the body. The county sheriff, though Protestant, deferred to the bishop's account given the priest's status, and the lack of any official complaint suggesting foul play. Most troubling was the bishop's manipulation of Dr. Hammond, who had expressed concerns about the implausible nature of the accidental death narrative given the wounds he observed while preparing the body for burial. Diocesan records indicate that Bishop Borges reminded Hammond of his, quote, obligations to confidentiality as a physician, and emphasized the, quote, grave damage to community harmony that would result from contradicting the official account. Hammond's reluctant compliance with this pressure represents one of the most concerning aspects of the institutional response, the leveraging of professional ethics to suppress truth rather than serve justice. What the bishop's letter did not specify was the additional complications of Sister Magdalena's pregnancy, now approaching its 4th month and impossible to conceal indefinitely. Records from the Magdalene Asylum indicate that Sister Magdalena arrived on March 17, 1876, admitted under the name Mary Smith, with a diagnosis of religious melancholia with delusions. The attending physician, Dr. William Casgrain, noted her pregnancy but was apparently informed that she had been violated by an unknown assailant before seeking refuge at the convent, a narrative designed to protect the Church from scandal while explaining her condition. Sister Magdalena was placed in isolation, ostensibly for her own protection, but effectively silencing any possibility of her account reaching the public. The most disturbing document from this period is a clinical assessment dated April 2, 1876, in which Dr. Casgrain writes, "Patient continues to insist upon 2 medical impossibilities. First, that she was diagnosed as congenitally infertile prior to her pregnancy, and second, that she experienced no physical relations yet found herself with child. When confronted with the biological impossibility of her claims, she becomes agitated, insisting that her condition represents either a divine miracle or a supernatural violation. Most concerning are her statements regarding the deceased priest, whom she alternately describes as a vessel of divine intervention and an instrument of darkness disguised in holy garments. Her description of the killing contains ritualistic elements, suggesting a mind deeply fractured from reality. The Magdalene Asylum's treatment records reveal the era's profound limitations in addressing mental illness, particularly when intertwined with religious experience. Sister Magdalena was subjected to standard treatments including cold water immersion, application of mustard plasters, and enforced bed rest, interventions designed to calm excessive nervous excitement, but which likely exacerbated her psychological distress. Most concerning were weekly sessions of moral therapy, during which clergy members attempted to correct her theological aberrations through repeated emphasis on her sins and need for repentance. These sessions, recorded in clinical notes as, quote, spiritual realignment, appear to have pushed Sister Magdalena further into silence rather than facilitating psychological healing. By June 1876, asylum records describe her as, quote, compliant but withdrawn, speaking rarely, and exhibiting minimal engagement with either staff or environment. This clinical deterioration paralleled her advancing pregnancy, with physical health assessments noting increasing frailty despite efforts to ensure adequate nutrition. Here we encounter the most inexplicable aspect of this case, the medical impossibility at its center. Modern medical experts who have reviewed Dr. Hammond's original diagnosis and subsequent examinations confirm that Sister Magdalena's described congenital condition, believed to be a form of Mayer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome, would indeed have made natural conception impossible. Yet her pregnancy was verified by multiple medical professionals. This apparent contradiction has led some researchers to question the accuracy of Hammond's initial diagnosis, while others have suggested more sinister possibilities, including the substitution of another woman for Sister Magdalena during her confinement at the asylum. What is documented with certainty is that on August 27, 1876, Mary Smith gave birth to a female child at the Magdalene Asylum. The birth record, discovered in 1978 during a cataloging of asylum documents, contains minimal information. Female infant born to patient MS, seemingly healthy despite difficult delivery. Infant removed as per institutional policy and transferred to St. Mary's Orphanage under care of the Sisters of Charity. The record is signed by Dr. Casgrain with an additional notation. Patient experienced severe hemorrhaging following delivery. Last rites administered by Father James Sullivan at 11:42 p.m. Patient expired at 12:17 a.m., August 28, 1876. Body remanded to diocesan authorities as per prior arrangement. Sister Magdalena's death certificate, issued under the name Mary Smith, lists cause of death as complications of childbirth, a common and rarely questioned determination in an era when maternal mortality remained high. Her body was released to diocesan authorities rather than family members, and burial records indicate interment in an unmarked grave within the Paupers section of Mount Eliot Cemetery in Detroit. No funeral service was recorded, and no obituary published, an extraordinary erasure of a woman who had spent 13 years in religious service. The only acknowledgement of her passing at St. Agatha's Convent was a brief announcement by Mother Nowak that, quote, Sister Magdalena has been called to God's mercy through illness, and a request for prayers for her soul. This deliberate obscuring of both her life and death represents perhaps the most profound institutional violence inflicted upon Sister Magdalena, the systematic erasure of her existence from official memory. The fate of Sister Magdalena's child represents another disturbing chapter in this narrative. Records at St. Mary's Orphanage list the arrival of a female infant identified only as, quote, Jane, daughter of deceased mother, father unknown, on August 28, 1876. The child remained at the orphanage until age 6, when she was adopted by Thomas and Margaret Brennan, a childless couple from Sault Ste. Marie. The adoption records contain a curious stipulation that the child was to receive Catholic education, but never to be informed of the circumstances of her birth or the identity of her biological parents, with yearly stipends provided to the adoptive family by the diocese to ensure compliance with these terms. Jane Brennan grew to adulthood without knowledge of her origins, eventually becoming a schoolteacher in Chicago. She married in 1898 and had 3 children of her own before her death from influenza in 1919. Her descendants remain unaware of their connection to the events at St. Agatha's, though genealogical research conducted in 2017 has confirmed the biological lineage through preserved medical samples from Jane Brennan's hospitalization prior to her death. The institutional response to the events of 1876 demonstrates a systematic effort to erase all evidence of what transpired. St. Agatha's Convent was officially closed in December 1876, with the remaining sisters dispersed to various institutions throughout the Midwest. The convent building was deconsecrated and sold to a logging company in 1877, eventually burning down in 1883, under circumstances described in local records as accidental ignition during seasonal operations. Mother Superior Nowak was reassigned to an administrative position at a convent in Philadelphia, where she remained until her death in 1901. Her personal papers, including the journal documenting the events leading to the murder, were sealed by ecclesiastical authorities and only discovered during the Second Vatican Council's mandate for historical transparency in the 1960s. The most explicit effort at institutional erasure is found in diocesan financial records from 1876 to 1880, which document significant expenditures for special consultations with various civil officials in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Transactions now recognized by historians as likely payments to ensure official silence regarding the true circumstances of Father Wojciechowski's death. The case might have remained permanently obscured were it not for the persistence of Dr. Hammond, whose ethical concerns overrode his deference to ecclesiastical authority. In 1891, 15 years after the events at St. Agatha's, Hammond prepared a sealed manuscript containing his complete medical observations and knowledge of the case, with instructions that it be opened upon his death. When Hammond died in 1903, his executor, a Protestant minister named Reverend Thomas Grant, honored this request and was so disturbed by the contents that he forwarded copies to both civil and Catholic authorities. The diocesan response was swift and comprehensive. Bishop John Foley of Detroit dismissed the manuscript as the ramblings of a physician clearly suffering diminished capacity in his final years, and successfully pressured civil authorities to classify the document as defamatory. All official copies were subsequently destroyed, though Reverend Grant had presciently retained his own copy, concealed within his personal Bible. This copy remained undiscovered until 1947, when Grant's granddaughter, Dr. Elizabeth Grant, a medical historian at the University of Michigan, found the manuscript while cataloging her grandfather's effects. Her subsequent investigation, conducted with scholarly rigor despite institutional resistance, forms the foundation of our modern understanding of the case. Dr. Elizabeth Grant's 1953 monograph, Miracle or Murder: The Medical Mystery of St. Agatha's Convent, represented the first academic examination of the events of 1876. Initially dismissed as sensationalism by both religious and medical authorities, Grant's work gained credibility when her research led to the discovery of Mother Nowak's sealed journal in archdiocesan archives. The journal corroborated Hammond's account in multiple particulars, particularly regarding Sister Magdalena's medical history and the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Father Wojciechowski's body. Its persistence resulted in a reluctant ecclesiastical review in 1962, conducted under the reformist atmosphere of the Second Vatican Council. This review, while acknowledging that grave events had occurred at St. Agatha's, stopped short of fully validating Grant's conclusions, instead emphasizing the, quote, complex psychological state of Sister Magdalena and suggesting that many details had been embellished through subjective interpretation. Nevertheless, the review represented the first official acknowledgement that the death of Father Wojciechowski was not accidental, but the result of homicide by a member of the religious community. Modern forensic psychiatrists who have studied the available evidence suggest that Sister Magdalena likely experienced a severe psychotic break triggered by the cognitive dissonance of her impossible pregnancy. Dr. Catherine Mercer, writing in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry in 2008, proposed that the subject experienced a catastrophic collapse of her religious identity framework when confronted with a physiological condition that contradicted both her medical understanding of her body and her vowed religious chastity. The ritualistic elements of the homicide suggest an attempt to transform an act of violence into a sacred rite of purification, essentially the creation of an alternative reality in which her actions represented divine justice rather than murder. This analysis is supported by the arrangement of the crime scene as described by witnesses, particularly the circular placement of candles around the body and the deliberate positioning of the priest in an attitude of prostration, suggesting a ritualized execution rather than an impulsive act of violence. The most recent development in this extraordinary case came in 2015, when ground-penetrating radar surveys of the former St. Agatha's property, conducted as part of an environmental assessment for a proposed development, identified anomalies consistent with a previously undocumented burial site. Subsequent archaeological investigation recovered the remains of an infant, approximately 6 to 9 months gestational age, interred in a small wooden box beneath what would have been the convent garden. Carbon dating placed the burial between 1875 and 1877, coinciding with the events documented in our narrative. DNA analysis of these remains was inconclusive due to degradation, but the location and timing strongly suggest a connection to the case of Sister Magdalena. The discovery raises disturbing questions about the actual outcome of her pregnancy. Did she give birth at the Magdalene Asylum as official records indicate? Or did her pregnancy end prematurely, possibly due to trauma or intervention, with the infant secretly buried at the convent? The archaeological evidence introduces yet another layer of uncertainty to a case already defined by contradictions and institutional obfuscation. What are we to make of this extraordinary case, with its convergence of medical impossibility, religious crisis, and institutional conspiracy? The available evidence supports several possible interpretations, each disturbing in its implications. If we accept Dr. Hammond's initial diagnosis of infertility as accurate, then Sister Magdalena's pregnancy represents either a genuine medical anomaly of the highest order or something that challenges our understanding of biological possibility. If we instead question Hammond's diagnosis, we must then confront the systematic abuse of power and violation of religious vows that occurred within an institution ostensibly dedicated to spiritual protection. Perhaps most troubling is the institutional response, the calculated decision to preserve reputation through deception, prioritizing ecclesiastical standing over transparency and justice. The case of Sister Magdalena Krawiec stands as a stark reminder of how institutions, when faced with internal corruption, may sacrifice individuals to maintain collective facade. As we conclude our examination of this disturbing chapter in American religious history, we return to the photograph with which we began, Sister Magdalena Krawiec, her eyes averted from the camera, her hands clasped in that peculiar tension between prayer and restraint. The image takes on new significance now that we understand the extraordinary circumstances that would unfold in the months following its capture. Her expression, initially read as simple modesty, now appears charged with premonition, a woman standing at the threshold of a nightmare that would challenge the very foundations of her faith, her understanding of her own body, and ultimately her sanity. The tragedy of Sister Magdalena lies not only in the violence she committed, but in the systematic erasure of her existence by the very institution to which she had dedicated her life. Her name appears in no official church martyrology or record. Her grave in the potter's field adjacent to the Magdalen Asylum bears no marker. She exists now only in scattered documents preserved through chance and the persistence of those unwilling to allow institutional power to completely obscure individual suffering. As with many historical injustices, full resolution remains impossible. We can neither restore Sister Magdalena's voice nor fully unravel the medical mystery at the heart of her case. What we can do, however, is acknowledge the complex humanity of all involved and recognize that beneath every institutional facade lie individual stories of struggle, contradiction, and sometimes terrible darkness.